And just thank you really to the conference organisers for this invitation and this opportunity to speak to you today. And while I'm saying thank you, I'd also just like to acknowledge that the ideas that I'm sharing with you today and the work that I'll be drawing on is really the product of collaborations and chats and thinking and working together with my collaborators and colleagues in this area. So, I mean, we all know that our intellectual endeavours are never a one-person job. So yes, so thank you to those people who have helped me shape my thinking. So onto the serious business at hand, our keynote. A keynote, as I see it, is an opportunity to reflect on some of the bigger issues for social psychology. So considering what we as scholars do, how we do it, and why. So my talk today speaks to these aspects. And while it concentrates specifically on my area of research, which is sexuality and reproduction, I hope that some of the insights will be relevant and applicable beyond and help you to think about your work differently, maybe inspire some thinking, and perhaps at the end we can have some productive questions and conversations. So let me start with the why question. Why we as scholars do what we do. This conference's thematic focus on well-being, I think, speaks to that question, highlighting the interest in human betterment that birthed social psychology and has spurred much of the work since then. But what might be considered betterment or count as well-being, as we know, has been the subject of debate within social psychology and beyond. Today, as we stare down our impending environmental crisis, find ourselves amid a global pandemic that has highlighted inequalities across nations and within them. And as we see these inequalities widening, I would argue that our understanding of well-being needs to be broad. It needs to be rooted in a social justice perspective that centres social change, so that people have equal access to well-being, to wealth, to health, to justice, to privileges and opportunity, regardless of their legal, political, economic or other circumstances. So that's really the thinking behind my title of "We're not okay until we're all okay." For me, it was partly inspired by the way that the current pandemic has brought home to me and to many of us the interconnection of all of our fates and well-being. And I think this is really how we should be thinking as social psychologists about our work and the impact that it makes in the world. So in my talk today, I want to zoom in on social psychology's role in social justice change making in the domain specifically of sexuality and reproduction. But as I said, I think some of the insights will transfer beyond. So this is not a trivial area of scholarship, although it has often been positioned in that way. But rather, I would argue, it's an area of work that concerns a key site of women's oppression and a highly politically charged arena that has consequences for all of our lives. And probably no one is more politically charged than these women's rights as experts. So otherwise known as people who protest outside of clinics offering abortion services. Research points to the negative consequences of these actions of protesting outside of clinics on the people who are actually attending the clinics, especially those who are already socially marginalised or vulnerable. And here in New Zealand, where I'm currently living and working, there's a bill under discussion to facilitate the safe, unimpeded access to abortion services. And really, it's difficult to think of or imagine many other instances in which patients would require special protection to access medical spaces. Abortion access has, of course, become a political dog whistle and a red flag topic, but there are countless other sexual and reproductive topics that raise strong public and personal responses. So we can think of test tube babies, providing contraception to people with intellectual disabilities, criminalising sex work, and the list goes on. So these examples and many possible others help us to see that reproduction is not simply a biological process, but one laden with ideological, moral, symbolic, and political meanings. It is a profoundly social issue. So it's really this socio-political dimension of sexual and reproductive issues that interests me as a researcher who's trained in social psychology, critical health psychology, and feminist theory. And I want to focus on how we as social researchers can attend to the important socio-political aspects of sexual and reproductive health and associated issues, which are often neglected in our broader discipline. Psychology, as we well know, has a tendency to encourage isolating the person from the systems in which they are embedded. If we think about reproductive issues, however, it's absolutely crucial to consider the politics that shape them. So let's take an example of maternal mortality. In South Africa, where I grew up and where I was trained, more than a quarter of avoidable deaths among pregnant women is related to unsafe abortion. And this is even though abortion is legally available on request in the country. So if we had to conduct research that looked only at abortion decision-making in the sense of a person's self-efficacy or how they might manage coercion, we'd miss important contextual aspects that delimit decision-making, such as how abortion stigma might deter people from state-funded services. So ideas about who is a good mother, what is a good woman, who should and shouldn't have children, religious and moral ideas. We know the kinds of ideology that surrounds the topic of abortion. But this might stop people from going to services, right? They might fear being treated badly by providers, being recognized by community people in the community when they attend the facility, or encountering harassment like the kind that we've already had a look at. So if they couldn't afford private care, they might be compelled to seek illegal but more private services or forced to see their pregnancy to term. If we looked only at those sort of individualized aspects of the issue, what kind of response would be generated without that sort of contextual information? Would it solve the issue or would it make it worse? And these might seem to be obvious questions, but yet when reviewing much of the reproductive research, the socio-political issues are not adequately taken into consideration. While there are some researchers who consider aspects like structural or institutional barriers or dynamics, most often the role of power relations is neglected. Indeed, research by feminist psychologists has highlighted how sexual and reproductive issues are shaped and constrained by, for instance, power and control in interactions with healthcare providers, or heterosexual encounters and relationships, or the gendered power relations related to sex and reproduction. So building on and expanding this work, some feminist psychologists have recently drawn attention to the reproductive justice framework as a valuable approach for unraveling the relations of power that surround sexuality and reproduction. Like many other feminist approaches used in this area of inquiry, the reproductive justice framework is attuned to the gender power dynamics and socio-political complexities that shape people's reproductive lives and experiences. But what's unique and especially useful about this framework is that it offers a way of extending analyses to consider the interconnected systemic oppressions that would be related to classism, sexism, heterosexism, and so on. The approach is immensely useful for its ability to generate the nuanced, complex, complete, and critical view that's necessary for understanding and responding to reproductive issues and the pernicious social inequities and power relations that underpin them. So I argue, along with other feminists and social psychologists, that reproductive justice as an analytical frame and political praxis is an excellent tool for contributing to social justice change-making in the domain of sexuality and reproduction. As Eaton and Stevens note in a recent editorial around the use of reproductive justice in psychology, this framework offers the opportunity to redefine and revolutionize our field, moving us from making incremental contributions to knowledge to taking leaps of understanding in established and new domains of inquiry. So the popularity of the reproductive justice framework has risen in social research, and some say it's become a buzzword. But its value appears not to be well recognized by social psychologists. And this slowness in social psychology, which I will comment on in more depth later in this talk, is a bit perplexing and disappointing because the subdiscipline has historically positioned itself as the vanguard of research about social issues and real-world problems. Given our unique training in interrogating social phenomena at the micro level of individual experience and the socio-structural or macro level, critical social psychologists are well placed to conduct research that illuminates the social complexities of sexual and reproductive issues. They can also, I would argue, potentially contribute to the necessary development of reproductive justice as an analytical lens, which is an area that is, in my opinion, wide open for contributions and thinking and development. So the low uptake of the reproductive justice framework is therefore a missed opportunity. Oh, sorry, got to get the controls working. So my task in the remainder of this talk is to convince you of the value of the reproductive justice framework for social psychology. And what I want to do first is provide a brief overview of the reproductive justice framework, and then go on to just demonstrate the value of this lens by looking at different scholarship and talking about what we can do with the knowledge that is generated from reproductive justice-oriented research. And then I'll comment on what this means for social psychology. So to briefly introduce the lens, and I'm really not doing it justice, it's a bit of a whirlwind tour, but some may not be that familiar, so I thought it would be useful just to orient ourselves. So reproductive justice is fundamentally a framework about power, and you'll hear me banging on a lot about power in this talk. It was developed by Black and women of color feminists in the USA in the 1990s. And it comes from this merging, or what Loretta Ross calls splicing, of the idea or the concept of reproductive justice and, reproductive rights and social justice to form reproductive justice. So it's a framework for identifying structural and systemic issues that need to be addressed to support sexual and reproductive rights. So what reproductive justice advocates are saying is that we need to address the social justice issues in order for people to realize their reproductive rights. So it's really linking the realization of rights to the achievements of social justice. A very important aspect of reproductive justice theory is, and the approach, and it is an advocacy tool, is its use of intersectionality. So it draws on intersectionality theory, which makes it, I think, very powerful and very useful. And it does this to, well, it draws on intersectionality theory to locate reproductive issues within interweaving networks of power relations, or what some call the matrix of domination, that enables or restricts the enactments of sexual and reproductive rights. So in this view, race, class, and other axes of difference co-create sexual and reproductive health experiences. And it means that reproductive oppression is experienced asymmetrically. So different groups experience it in different ways. Importantly, though, the focuses on structural inequalities and the interrelationship of systems of domination. So it's not just about the multiple intersecting identities, which we often hear people speaking about, and beyond academe, that's become the kind of way of speaking about it. But it's really about the structural issues. So the thinking is that our experiences at the micro level that are related to our social identities, like race, class, gender, sexuality, and so on, are seen as indicative of these larger interlocking social inequalities at the macro social structural level. So racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, and so forth. So what does it look like, or how would we apply a reproductive justice as an analytical framework? So this is an area, as I have intimated, that is still being developed. But I would say that a reproductive justice oriented analysis would involve locating reproductive issues within these multiple social power relations of specific contexts that structure people's reproductive lives. So this would include structural and systemic dynamics, social relations shaped by gender, ethnicity, race, class, and other social categorizations, and sociocultural discourses and practices. And what's also quite important is that these power relations are contextualized in relation to the historical oppressions that contribute to the systematic devaluation and regulation of marginalized populations' fertility. So we can think about colonization and slavery and the population control movement from the 1960s and the kinds of injustices around reproduction and sex and sexuality that happened during that time, just as an example. So the reproductive justice approach can advance our understanding of these multidimensional power dynamics in which reproductive issues are embedded by untangling some of the underlying social factors, all of which have a complex and intricate connection to gendered relations. So these could include the issues like access to information, education, or services, sexual exploitation and violence, social and economic deprivation, and so forth, and the kinds of norms, social cultural practices, ideologies and power relations that surround these particular issues. So in order to demonstrate how this approach is applied, and I think also to illustrate how it's useful, I want to review some research and compare the sort of mainstream, or I'd say research that's conducted under the reproductive rights rubric with the with the reproductive justice oriented type research, and draw out the distinctions in order to show what the reproductive justice oriented research adds. So I'm going to look at the area of research that I'm working on at the moment, which is around coercion, autonomy, and agency in the context of contraceptive decision-making. And I chose this not just because it's my particular area of interest at the moment, but also because I think it's useful for our purposes as a case study, talking about power relations, because women's access to and use of contraception has historically been enmeshed in reproductive politics. So let's look first at the rights-oriented research. So under the growing influence of the sexual and reproductive health and rights paradigm, which is really the dominant way that we frame sexual and reproductive health in most of the world, family planning initiatives across the world now prioritize voluntary rights-based approaches to contraceptive care. And in response to this, researchers have focused on issues surrounding reproductive autonomy, understood, for instance, as people's ability to choose and act on their own choice, or the power to make personal health-related decisions that impact their lives and well-being. So here we can see the emphasis is on choosing and acting and personal choice. So accordingly, researchers have focused on intra and interpersonal aspects of contraceptive decision-making and care, like self-efficacy, decision-making power, communication, management of coercion. And the goal in this work is to identify ways of strengthening individual agency so as to enable effective contraceptive use and control of whether or when one becomes pregnant. For example, researchers might seek to increase self-determination and decision-making. Others have sought to identify barriers to choice, such as the nature and quality of health communication, patient-provider interactions, or women's knowledge, attitudes, or perceptions of particular methods, especially long-acting contraceptive methods, or LARC, or their knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions of pregnancy, unintended pregnancy more generally. And the assumption of this work is that contraceptive autonomy can be improved by removing these obstructions and preventing interference with decisions. And I would say that this work is useful, but it also tends to concentrate on individual level factors and doesn't fully capture the social context in which contraceptive decision-making occurs, including the ways that this context might constrain people's choices. There's some research that goes a bit beyond this sort of focus on the individual and looks at the institutional context as a space that could limit contraceptive autonomy. For example, a recent study sought to explore the extent to which contraceptive coercion exists in family planning programs in sub-Saharan Africa and tried to identify the sorts of forms that it might take. And the researchers interviewed healthcare providers at these settings, as well as women using the services. And the participants shared stories of coercion that varied in type and severity, ranging from things that subtly constrain autonomy, like biased or directive counselling, dramatically limited contraceptive method mixes, scare tactics, provision of false medical information, to more overt actions like the refusal to remove a provider-dependent method like an IUD or an implant, and also providing these methods without the consent of patients. So, for example, here's a quote from the research from one of the participants, a service user, and she says, it's like they battered you up, like they lied to you. They tell you to put in the method, that you can take it out whenever you like. Then you arrive at the health centre and they refuse to take it out. So what this quote illustrates quite nicely is the sort of subtle coercion, the battering up, as well as the more overt, the refusal to remove the contraceptive implant. And what this research also found was that a lot of this coercion had its roots in structural causes rather than individual intentions. So what they highlight in particular is the role of government targets in promoting fertility reduction. So here is a quote from one of the administrators that was interviewed, and they say, we try to see what's really working. We look at the prevalence rate. For example, at the beginning of the year, there is a certain quota. We say that each health centre has to have a certain percentage for family planning. So here the administrator is describing how this particular region or location uses targets at health centres to incentivise healthcare workers to meet specific contraceptive uptake targets. And there's financial benefits attached to increasing uptake, and providers are held accountable to their supervisors if these targets are not met. And the findings indicate that these targets create perverse incentives for some healthcare providers to prioritise contraceptive uptake and inadvertently encourages coercive practices like the ones that we heard described, even though there might not be any ill intent on the part of healthcare providers. So while the study expands understandings of coercion beyond overt or intentional actions, which is useful, I would argue that it overemphasizes choice and intentional, measurable, agentic actions. It's assumed that enhancing patient autonomy simply requires preventing interference with decision-making and removing barriers to free, informed, full choice. So the kinds of interventions that might be based on this knowledge might involve training healthcare workers around communication and counseling practices to make sure that they don't interfere with patients' choices, or ensuring that institutional practices support decision-making, for example, that there's enough of a range of contraceptives that people can choose from and people are aware of the different options. So these are great practical steps and that would certainly be needed in this setting. Is it enough? Do they get to the heart of the issue? What health equity scholars would say, would call the causes of the causes. From a reproductive justice perspective, as I'm sure you've anticipated, the answer would be no. Choice is not only constrained by material realities like access barriers or institutional practices, but also by context-specific social norms, unequal social relations, which may be gendered, related to ethnicity, they may be racialized, class and location-based, and also related to discriminatory socio-cultural discourses and practices. The fetishizing of personal autonomy in this kind of research overshadows the way that choices are always contingent, partial, and lived by people within particular sociocultural contexts. So reproductive justice-oriented research would also be interested in how the larger ideologies and meanings about, I mentioned earlier, good womanhood and motherhood would come to bear in these spaces, for example, but not just in terms of how they shape the interactions in these locations, but also women's actual choices. And my point really is that the overemphasis on choice is problematic because it's a partial view, but it also has potentially negative consequences for women because it potentially reinforces those discourses of women's responsibility for self-control of fertility and pregnancy prevention. So moving to the reproductive justice-oriented research, in contrast, research that takes this approach highlights how contraceptive agency is constrained by contextual issues, especially intersecting inequities. So to draw on an example from my own research, at the moment my colleagues and I are conducting a transnational study in South Africa and New Zealand around contraceptive use, especially long-acting contraceptives or LARCs. And we interviewed healthcare workers as well as women who are using the services in both of these countries. And we asked them about their experiences of contraceptive consultations and counselling, and especially about their decision-making in relation to LARCs. And in this, the findings that I'm going to touch on today is from a paper where we used the reproductive justice approach alongside post-structural feminist theory to highlight how contraceptive agency is enabled or restricted by power relations. And our findings highlight intersecting relations of power in participants' accounts of interactions in contraceptive care. And we found that contraceptive agency is restricted in two ways. So the first way was by provider-patient power relations. So this is really the common positioning of the healthcare providers as experts, which accords them more power in decision-making processes. So this quote illustrates what I'm meaning by this. And it's from one of the service users. She said, "It really was a lot of doctor-nurse-led, this is what we think is going to be best for you. You should give this a go. Like, if I'd said to my doctor then, no, I don't want to be on the jab, they would have been like, well, we don't think that's the best option for you. And when a doctor says, we don't think that's a good option, you kind of just nod and agree. So here she's just describing this deferring to the expert authority and going along with what the expert thinks because they are an expert. And what's quite interesting is this kind of pattern of interaction was described in that research that I used in the previous example, the research in sub-Saharan Africa, where the researcher notes that participants expressed what she calls an underlying faith in both the motives and tactics of providers, and that they tended to respect providers' learnedness. But this is interpreted simply as blinding women to the coercion that's happening and not actually part of the coercive practice itself. So these accounts of patients' faith are not connected to the power relations in the provider-patient relationship that are buttressed by medical and in some instances male authority, and the paternalism that's often inherent in women's healthcare, especially in relation to younger women and women of colour. Which brings me to the next finding. So the second way that agency is restricted is by power relations related to age and race. And obviously I'm speaking about these as though they are discrete dynamics, but of course they intersect and interact. This quote here illustrates, well, a few quotes illustrates what what we found. So this is a participant from New Zealand, and she says, you get your rights almost taken away from you because you wouldn't know any better because you're just a baby. So you basically do what you're told. There's no collaboration when you're younger. Another New Zealand participant says, I think I didn't have a choice in the end because I was Maori and young and out of school. Like, I'm just going to be another unplanned teenage pregnancy. And a South African participant said, obviously, when you're being discharged from hospital, they do inject you with injectable contraceptive. In fact, they don't tell you and don't beg you, especially if you're a child and you have a child, they don't beg you. They don't ask you if you want it, the contraceptive or not. So even though there was overt response, support of the patient's right to choose in the among the service users as well as the service providers, the healthcare interactions that were described were most often swayed towards the side of coercion in more or less subtle ways. So that's kind of similar to what we saw in the previous example, but what we also pick up on, because of the intersectional lens that we're using, is how this coercion is compounded by race and class politics. And these are the politics, of course, that shape determinations around who should or shouldn't bear children. And as a result, long-acting contraceptives in particular, and contraception more broadly, can actually act as a source of oppression for women who are deemed socially undesirable reproducers. So using a reproductive justice approach in this instance expands the meaning of reproductive control, shedding light on the complexity of decision-making around contraceptives and showing not only the more subtle ways that reproductive agency might be restricted, but also for whom. So if we had to, well, we did, develop recommendations from these findings, we would condemn practices groups through particular kinds of counselling strategies, incentives or other means. And these are obviously young people, poor people, people of colour, Indigenous people. So just on that note, while we're talking about recommendations and outcomes of research, I wanted to make a final comment on the kinds of solutions that can be generated or kinds of interventions that can be generated from the knowledge produced in reproductive justice-oriented research. I'm not really going to do it justice here, but it is really important to touch on because Reproductive justice was developed in activist spaces originally, and has developed from a kind of advocacy tool to now being applied in academic research. But the founders are very firm that the application of knowledge is crucial, which is great news for us as social psychologists who want to make a difference in the world. So to illustrate how we can, the kinds of recommendations and solutions that could arise from this kind of work, I'll just draw on a policy work that I've done here in New Zealand with a colleague of mine. We looked at sexual and reproductive health policy, and the particular analytical focus that we took was enabled by the reproductive justice framework and its dual focus on both rights and equity. So in our analysis, we identified a strong reliance in the policy on individualized neoliberal risk discourse. And we showed how this risk was inadvertently construed as related to group identity. So being young, being Maori, Indigenous, being female, rather than the social context that these people live in, living in a patriarchal society, in poverty, being, a part of a group who was colonized. And as a result of this kind of view, Indigenous people are potentially pathologized by the policy, which is completely opposite to the stated intention of the policy, of course. So, for instance, the policy reinforces the view of teenage pregnancy as an Indigenous issue or Maori problem. And young Indigenous women in particular are pathologized. So to address this, some people have suggested reframing the policy from a rights-based perspective. And we argued that this is only part of the solution and pointed to the potential for rights-based approaches to be co-opted into this neoliberal agenda that focuses on individual autonomy and personal choice-making and exercising your individual rights, and really, once again, boiled down to choice, which would, of course, reinforce the individualizing tendencies of the policy. So we argued rather for a reproductive justice framing, because in addition to rights, this brings a focus on equity. So it moves us beyond the individual and the choices that the individual makes and the at-risk individual to foregrounding, in this instance, young people's social realities and the contextual factors that sustain the uneven distribution of sexual and reproductive health difficulties. So, for example, family violence, the lack of housing, and highlighting these societal issues helps shift responsibility from young Indigenous women having to make wise choices to the state's role in addressing inequalities. So for Indigenous youth, for whom earlier parenthood is a cultural norm, rather than seeing this as a transgression of the ideal life course, which of course is Western and neoliberal, and therefore necessarily problematic, the emphasis would be on the state's responsibility to provide adequate conditions to support young Indigenous parenting. So, coming back to the issue of using reproductive justice in social psychology. I'm aware that I'm running a little bit over time, so yes, let's get to the crux of it. So research illuminating the clear and entrenched gendered, racialized, and class-based dimensions of reproductive issues reaffirms that our sexual and reproductive lives are not lived in a socio-political vacuum. It's essential, therefore, that researchers pay attention to the socially embedded character of sexual and reproductive issues, including the power relations and inequities within which people are located. So this means attending to women's and other marginalized groups' power in society, given their spatial and social location, the intersectionality of their social identities, and the processes by which gender and other social identities affect individuals' power, decision-making, and reproductive health. So I think that social psychologists are well placed to conduct this kind of holistic research in the area of sexual and reproductive issues and associated issues. And the lack of engagement with the reproductive justice framework is, as I've said, a missed opportunity. So there's been relatively little explicit engagement within the wider discipline with the framework of reproductive justice, aside from a handful of psychologists and feminist psychologists. And this can really be seen as part of a larger pattern in psychology in which the mainstream undervalues social issues and social justice scholarship, which is more likely to be undertaken, as we know, by those from devalued social groups. So Eaton and Stevens attribute the lack of engagement with reproductive justice theory to psychology's generally slow acceptance of non-Western and or gynocentric lenses, the discipline's resistance to critiquing power within and across the research process, and the tradition, which I've already mentioned, of isolating the individual as the unit of study from the systems in which they are embedded. So reproductive justice bumps up against some of psychology's disciplinary norms. It challenges psychology's role in reproducing knowledge that could serve the status quo, including the mobilization of the power of science. It encourages researchers to reflect on and be transparent about our epistemological positions and associated power relations. And it values methodologies that center the experiences, knowledge, and understandings of marginalized groups as the experts of their own lives. The framework therefore challenges the dominance of positivism and post-positivism, the use of the natural scientific method in social research, and the assumption of objective neutrality. Because reproductive justice centers the experience of the marginalized, as Eaton and Stevens point out, the framework requires that we challenge and rebuild basic constructs, such as who and what is included in and used to represent human well-being. For critically oriented social psychologists, this challenge is a welcome extension of our existing work. Indeed, considering the benefits of the approach for critical psychologists, Avery and Stanton argue that utilizing a reproductive justice framework can subvert the mandates of the hegemonic discourses and methods that have functioned to justify and maintain the reproductive and sexual disempowerment of women of color and other marginalized groups. And in so doing, we may transform the field of psychology as well as improve reproductive health. So as I've argued today, the reproductive justice lens attunes investigations to relations of power surrounding sexual and reproductive issues in a way that encompasses interconnected systemic oppressions. I maintain, therefore, that the framework makes an excellent addition to the conceptual toolkit of justice-oriented social psychologists studying sexual and reproductive issues. And I hope to see increased engagement by critical social psychologists, as well as much needed innovation to reproductive justice theorizing. And I look forward to transformation not only in the field of psychology and social psychology, but to reproductive health and beyond. Thank you.